This lesson is 3.3. It's called Estimating Fractions. Hit pause anytime you need to in order to record this information into your notes. First of all, what does it mean to estimate? It means to make a value close to a whole number. So if we have decimals or fractions, the number we want to hold in our head or use today is not going to have a decimal or fraction, but instead is going to be a whole number. For example, if I'm thinking of the number 2 1/8, I'm going to be estimating that to a whole number like 2. Now, why do we estimate? We estimate for two reasons. It allows us to calculate things mentally, and it also verifies if our answer that we get makes sense when we're done. So I'm going to give you 4 practice problems, and the first 2 are going to be addition. The second 2 are going to be subtraction. So the first one is 4/9 plus 3/11. We are going to estimate these fractions to whole numbers. When I think of the fraction 4/9, I have a couple choices here. I can estimate that fraction to one of these 3. It's closest to nothing, it's close to half of something, or it's close to a whole. And I do this by looking at my denominator of 9. And I ask myself, what's half of 9? Half of 9 is 4.5. And I'm going to use that number to compare my numerator with. So 0 stays as 0. The whole would be 9 out of 9. And a half of 9 is 4.5. So looking at my numerator, which of these numbers is the numerator closest to? And in this situation, it's close to 4.5. So I'm going to estimate this fraction as a half. And I'm going to do the same thing for my second fraction. My fraction is 3/11, and I can estimate it to either close to nothing, close to half, or close to a whole. So my numerator here, my denominator is an 11, and half of 11 is 5.5. Nothing would still be 0, and a whole would be 11/11. So I'm looking at my numerator of 3, and I'm trying to figure out what it's closest to. Closest to 0, closest to 5.5, or closest to 11. So it's 3 away from this one. It's 2.5 away from this one. So 2.5 is closer. So I think that's the better choice. So again, I'm going to go with a half here. So if I were to estimate this fraction, 1/2 plus 1/2, my answer is going to be 1. Example number 2. I have mixed numbers on this one. I have 4 7/8 plus 8 2/5. I'm going to estimate my fraction since I have a whole number here. It's going to be between 4, 4.5, or 5. Those are my choices with mixed numbers. Again, I'm going to go back to my denominator of 8, and I'm going to ask myself, what's half of 8? Well, half of my 8 is 4. Nothing would be 0, and a whole would be 8/8. So looking at my numerator here, which of these 3 numbers, 0, 4, or 8, is the 7 closest to? It's closest to the 8, which means I'm going to estimate this fraction as almost 5. Moving over to 8 2/5, my choices are 8, 8.5, or 9. And I'm going to look at my denominator, which is 5, and ask myself, what's half of 5? Half of 5 is 2.5. I still could have nothing, and a whole would be 5/5. Which of these 3 numbers is the number 2 closest to? I think it's closest to 2/5. So I'm going to use 8.5 as my estimate. So I'm going to take 5 plus 8.5, and my answer would be 13.5 for my estimate. Now I'm going to switch to subtraction, but my mindset still stays the same. My thinking still stays the same. So with 6 3/4 minus 2 1/8, my choices here are 6, 6.5, and 7. Now we're going to take a look at our denominator of 4 and ask ourselves what's half of that. Half of 4 is 2. Or I could have nothing, or I could have a whole. So 4/4 would be a whole. Looking at your numerator, which one of these three numbers is 3 closest to? Well, this is a little tricky. It's actually 1 away from here and 1 away from here, which means I have 2 correct choices here. I can either use 6.5 as my estimate and be correct, or I could use 7 as my estimate and I'm still going to be correct. Both choices are good choices. So I'm going to put both of them down. Now I have the fraction or the mixed number 2 1/8. My choices here are 2, 2.5, and 3. Now looking at my denominator of 8, half of that, halfway would be 4. Or I could have nothing, or a whole would be 8/8. Looking at my numerator, which one of these three numbers is the number 1 closest to? 1 is closest to the 0. So I'm going to use 2 as my estimate. Now, depending on which one you used for an estimate at the beginning for your mixed number, I know 7 minus 2 is 5. Now, if I take 6.5 minus 2, my answer is going to be 4.5. Now, notice these two answers are very close to each other, which is fine. We're estimating, and both answers would be correct. Your final example is also subtraction. I have 10.5 minus 4 3/5. Looking at my mixed number, my choices are 10, 10.5, and 11. And I notice right away that this number is exactly the same as one of my options. So I'm going to stick with it. It's a good number to use. So I'm going to use 10.5 as my estimate. Now I'm going to work with my other mixed number, 4 3/5. My choices are 4, 4.5, and 5. Looking at my denominator of 5, what's half of 5? Half of 5 is 2.5. Or I could have nothing, or I can have a whole. So that'd be 5/5. Which of these three numbers is the number 3 closest to? 3 is closest to 2.5, so I'm going to use 4.5 as my estimate. And then I'm going to subtract 10.5 minus 4.5, which is 6. So that's how we're going to tackle estimation of fractions and mixed numbers with addition and subtraction.